a la última, a la séptima conferencia de este ciclo de conferencias sobre la música del Mediterráneo antiguo. En el día de hoy, ya saben, tenemos el placer y el orgullo de que nos acompañe el profesor Stephan Hagel. La mayoría de los que están aquí presentes sabrán quién es, pero por las dudas, una breve semblanza. Stephan Hagel es doctor en filología clásica por la Universidad de Viena. Trabaja como investigador principal en la Academia Austríaca de Ciencias, con foco en la música de la antigüedad, teoría musical griega y su relación con la práctica, instrumentos musicales y cuestiones de rítmica. Su trabajo implica la reconstrucción de instrumentos y técnicas de ejecución que han sido frecuentemente comunicadas al público internacional mediante conferencias, conciertos.
En alemán, en inglés.
Sus investigaciones se caracterizan por una aplicación extensiva de técnicas informáticas y métodos matemáticos. Bueno, para muchos de nosotros ha sido importantísimo importantísimo el trabajo del profesor Hagel a través de sus artículos, a través de sus libros, y es inestimable que hoy esté con nosotros en este ciclo. Me decía que, bueno, que a lo largo de su exposición, quien quiera puede levantar la mano, puede digamos, escribir en el chat o para plantear preguntas o para pedir si hay algún punto que no se entiende, para que lo pueda refrescar, explicar de nuevo. Así que, bueno, estamos todos ansiosos de la presentación del profesor Hagel. Y bueno, le voy a pasar la palabra. Stephan, we are extremely grateful to you, who has kindly accepted our invitation, and we are very, very happy to have you here with us. So I give you the word.
Yep, so thank you, thanks for having me. Is the sound quality okay? Can everybody understand me all right?
Yes.
I'll try to talk as clearly as I can, but yeah, anything goes wrong, just tell me, please. Yeah, ancient harmonic theory within 1 hour. I noticed that some of you seem to have quite a good understanding of ancient musical matters, and I suppose there will be others who have barely touched the subject, so it will be a bit difficult, and as Sergio told you, interrupt me, raise your hands if I don't notice you, then Sergio can interrupt me, or you just unmute yourself. So, Greek harmonic theory is exceptional in being very pristine. So what we know from medieval and modern music theory, that all came from a tradition that came from a different musical culture. So modern music theory with all its keyboard centrism and all the many instruments came from medieval music theory, which was based mainly on chant, and medieval music theory regurgitated and adapted ancient music theory, which it got mainly through Latin sources, which were in turn translated or adapted from Greek sources. And those sources from Greek late antiquity again depended on Greek sources from almost 1,000 years earlier. And you can imagine how much music itself might change in that period. So all that long history, which is a history of direct transmission, cuts through many changes in actual musical culture. But when ancient music theory, ancient harmonics was conceived, it was conceived on the basis of contemporary music. And this I find fascinating because it gives us a better opportunity to understand what was going on there. Later periods, we always need to sift apart what was contemporary music and what was just musical tradition of musical writings. Not so in this period. So let me see. Okay. So when we talk about ancient harmonics, two very different fields may come into view. One is about intervals, and the other is about scales, systemata in ancient Greek. And with intervals, we think about Pythagoras and his followers, which is largely later reattribution and invention. And with scales, we should think about Aristoxenus in turn. These two fields of investigation don't touch a lot in antiquity. They get reintegrated within each other only quite late, mostly with Ptolemy, but have an independent life. And while the whole scales science, so to say, is intimately connected with music people were making and music where people were making instruments for, the whole interval thing was sort of a much more academic endeavor. But let me start with some preconceptions we get with modern music and modern music theory that typically obstruct understanding of ancient music. One is simply Orientalism, conceiving the Greeks as the other. This has been around not so much in earlier times, but has become a big thing in the 20th century, and particularly also in the German environment. So Greek language was so different from ours in how it sounded, and Greek poetry was so intimately connected with music, and we can't really understand it because our language is different, our music is so different. There's just so much value in that, because ultimately the musics are not that different, and I think we can understand it. So then there's the complete opposite way of thinking, Eurocentrism, understanding everything through the Western tradition of music, the idea as we, whatever that is, Europe or the European colonies all over the world, continue Greek-Roman culture, and therefore Greek music is basically the prehistory of our music. That's wrong as well. We can't claim that. The Arabic music, Makam music, might have a greater claim, or at least an equal claim, to being to the inheritance of ancient Greek music than we do. Then, of course, there's all sorts of musicological naivety to take things for granted which are modern. For instance, the preponderance of the note we call Si or Do in understanding the tonality, which is of course weird because Si is the third letter of the alphabet, not the first. Why is it so important? That has to do with our modern history, and only starts in the High Middle Ages. Perhaps we have a little bit of time to talk about that. And then there's the problem that the so-called church modes have Greek names, but those are secondary and have very little historical continuity with the ancient Greek names. So those were not really used. Then we had different terms for the church modes, which did not stand in any direct connection with the ancient modes, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, and so on. But those ancient names were remapped onto medieval scales, octave scales later, but remapped in a way that did not reflect ancient understanding. So perhaps a big misunderstanding. At any rate, the letter names don't help at all in understanding Greek music. We have a hard time understanding the meaning of Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian in ancient music at all, but it was certainly not what we get in the so-called church modes. And then, of course, there's the propagation of legends, of ancient myth, mostly late antique myth, centering around Pythagoras. Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans as somebody who invented musicology and invented even music, styles of music, and that's all unhistorical. So what has been attributed to Pythagoras is mostly things we have no real reason to even think that Pythagoras believed or worked on. So in the Pythagorean thinking and all their number centrism, music certainly played a great role. But whether they developed that or that was just around in the archaic Greek period, around all the pre-Socratic philosophy and science, and they just focused on things that everybody knew, we can't really know because we have very little writings from that time. All the more about physics. Let me give you an example. This is from still the standard edition of Boethius. Boethius' books on music were partially sort of translated, but rather adapted from Nicomachus, except for the last book, which is adapted from Ptolemy. And here Boethius gives the 2-octave scale, so 15 notes, 7 notes per octave, 2 octaves plus the note 2 octaves above the bass notes, makes 15 notes, and that's the Greek model scale. In the edition, it looks like that, and you clearly can see that the graphical implementation seeks to distinguish between tones and semitones here. So between A and B, there's a large gap, between B and C again, and then there's a smaller gap. So this tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, this is clearly our scale of major, C major, for instance. While, however, the scale Boethius has in mind was clearly very different. It was more like this. I furnished this with modern note names, not absolute pitch, but just relative pitch, do, re, mi, so in this case, la, si, do. So this would be kind of 2 octaves of natural minor scale, Aeolian scale as modern music tells. And you can see that the tones and semitones are not distributed like Boethius had them, but that the editor here shifted the whole thing by a minor third, so that it would just be our major scale, that's what we are all oriented towards. So a clear misunderstanding with somebody who edited the most important ancient Latin musical texts. So even there, right in the heart of our science, people don't understand what they are doing necessarily. Of course, it's an old edition. Nowadays, people might avoid the same problem. But if you go to the text, and you need to go to this edition, and we'll find an illustration that does not reflect the ancient reality. Yeah, here Boethius introduces that 2-octave scale in order to cut octaves out of it, starting with the lowest octave and then 1 tone higher and the semitone higher and again. So we would get all different possible shapes of octaves, starting with a tone, with a semitone, with a tone and tone above, with a tone and semitone above. So all the 7 possible diatonic or whatever shapes of the octave. So this was one of the major reasons to have a 2-octave model scale, because you could take snippets out of it, octave-sized snippets, or if you were interested, snippets the size of a fifth or even a fourth, and then see what possible shapes are there. Yeah, so A and Boethius A is still the reason why our note name A is at that place in the scale where it is. So that's already ancient. It starts in the Latin tradition. Here you can see that it's just the alphabet mapped over 2 octaves. To restart the second octave again with A instead of continuing it is later a medieval practice, acknowledging that we perceive notes an octave apart as basically the same thing. That's something the ancient expressed, something that Ptolemy above all expressed very, very clearly, which was understood by Arabic writers in the Middle Ages, and which was evidently basis of much older music in the ancient Near Eastern tradition. So we find this in musical practice in the cuneiform sources, Babylonian, Akkadian sources. So if you have a look at this 2-octave scale, here it is in green in its diatonic shape. Diatonic, again in ancient terms, means using tones as much as possible, and between the tone and sometimes a semitone is left over, lema, left over. And then if you continue tuning the same way, you get additional semitones, and these are the particular 2 semitones in the octave, F sharp and C sharp, which were needed for the ancient chromatic scale. That's one tuning way, proceeding a little bit over diatonic, not filling in all the 12 semitones in the octaves as we do nowadays, or as they did in ancient China, quite at the same period as when the Greeks developed their music theory, but just a few to get a scale which they used melodically. It's not a complete description of semitones. And if you take these 2 together, you get the complete system, which happens to be completely symmetric around a central note. And the central note is called meses, central note in ancient Greek theory as well. Yeah, and funnily you go tone, semitone, larger semitone, smaller semitone, tone in both directions if you combine these 2 scales. Now, if you are interested in calculating the numbers for intervals, and you start from what we now understand are frequency relations, so an octave is twice the frequency of the lower note, or double the string length of the higher note, and the fifth is 3 to 2, the fourth is 4 to 3. If you calculate all of this, you get very nice fifths and fourths throughout, but the semitones have 2 different values, and both are mathematically rather nasty. Mathematically minded theorists tried to find better solutions which have nicer numbers. So for instance, we find the solution of Didymus, probably in the 1st century, who replaced the semitones by different sizes and ended up with this solution here. And we can switch between the 2, and you can see musically it's a bit different, but the symmetry is still the same. So for all intentions of looking at the diagram, it's much the same. Whether it sounds well is another question, but mathematically it works well. Ptolemy criticized it and says, well, the numbers may be nice, but this does not reflect the sizes of the intervals we actually hear in the concert hall. And probably he was right with that. For the, to go a bit deeper into our topic, we need to look at concepts, how understanding of a pitch system might evolve at all. Because music doesn't need music theory. You start from an instrument, you deal with an instrument, you learn how to tune an instrument, how to make an instrument. You may learn how to make an instrument without terminology, without understanding what's going on, just by listening to something or by direct oral transmission from teacher to student. But in that process, some proto-harmonic understanding may emerge and then develop into true music theory. So what are the activities? Tuning an instrument is very important if you have strings, for instance. You need to tune a number of strings before you start playing, especially if they are all open strings like on lyres and on harps. And also on lutes, because then you have some strings and need to tune the intervals if you have frets on the lutes. So there's something you need to learn even before you start playing. If you're an instrument maker or your own instrument maker, then you need to know where to drill finger holes if it comes to pipes or flutes. And then finally, you might want to understand what's going on in a melody, or when you play a melody, that's already a step in the direction of pure theory. And finally, there may be the endeavor of naming pitch structures, how to call something. If you have different tunings of your instruments and you want to tell your student how to tune it, you need a term for it. And finally, you might build an experimental instrument to get your pitch structures more clearly. In the ancient Greek world, we know there was the canon, the monochord, or a series of monochords with similar strings. And finally, you might want to do calculations, and I should try to hide this. How does this work? Out. Wrong one, sorry. There we are. So, and the last step is calculations. And this might be simply perception-based calculations. So we got an octave, we got another octave, and we say 1 octave plus 1 octave is 2 octaves. Or if you want to deal with string length or distances on a flute, you can't add it, then you need to multiply the distances and say, yes, 5 centimeters for one octave, and another octave then needs twice 5 centimeters. It's 10. And the third octave is 20, not 15. So the first part belongs directly to musical practice, and the second part is what is the start and development of music theory. And there are several pathways from one to the other, from tuning to naming, from melodies to naming structures. So this sounds like a different mode, and this mode sounds like what the Lydians sing, so let's call it the Lydian mode. Building an instrument, how to drill the finger holes, let's drill them in the way the Phrygians drill them, something like that. And then when we are already in the realm of theory, if we have a physical physical instrument, we need to do calculations by multiplication. And then we might start from perception and also transfer this to experimental instruments, but not doing physical distances, but in this case, just doing auditory tuning of strings, for instance, like Aristoxenus obviously had done. So Aristoxenus doing a proof that you can treat all the semitones as equal, like we do in modern tempered music. So how do we get from one to the other? One way would be from lutes, of course, because lutes have all this harmonical size built into their fretboard. On the guitar, you can really see the semitones as markings on the fretboard. But that seems not to have been the way it developed in ancient theory, because lutes just came a bit too late. Instead, pipes and flutes seem to have been a way, and perhaps also observing melodies. And then the whole Aristoxenean theory developed from lyres, harps, all the kind of things you just tuned by ear. So our main instruments are the lyre, like here the kithara, and the double pipe, here the rather long aulos in the hands of Marsyas. And that's the instruments I will focus on for the next half hour or so. So we had harps, which would give us a lot of strings, although they are open. They might have played a role, but we find them almost exclusively in the hands of women in the ancient period, and this gives a certain social barrier between practicing musicians and the writers of music theory and the conception of music theory. Lutes came seemingly late, so that's our first depiction of a lute in Mantinea. So we are already at the start of the Hellenistic period almost, and this was at the point when everything was almost ready. So Aristoxenus was already around, and people were already starting to pull all the strings together for that final edifice of Aristoxenean music theory that then persisted basically almost unchanged up to the end of antiquity. We had flutes, one almost completely preserved. Again, flutes, you can see they had a rather pastoral connotation and probably did not play a big role in the conception of theory. And again, later there came the organ, but also the development of the organ already built on pre-existing understanding of harmonic systems, and probably did not much contribute to their development in the first place. So lyres, kithara, or the tortoiseshell things, or the earlier round-based things, with originally evidently with 7 strings typically. Then later it seems that 9 strings were the standard for simpler types of music. So I believe that 9 strings were what the Roman period educated upper class teenager would have learned during their school time, and professionals would have still more strings, modulating strings, but much more difficult to play because you got only 5 fingers to dampen strings while strumming them, and 5 fingers for 11 strings. That calls for some dexterity. And on the other hand, the aulos. And again, the aulos is just one name for a great variety of different types, from the simple early bone or lost wooden or cane types to later instruments with different kinds of mechanism, also wooden instruments without mechanism. So it came in many lengths, from 25 centimeters or even less to longer than a meter, and that's only our archaeology of what we currently have. So that may not have been the extremes. Yeah, but the double pipes. Here there's only one pipe in the picture because when I studied it, the two pipes were to different museums. I didn't get a picture of both of them together. So if we look at that double pipe development, we have that development of mechanisms. First, sliders for base hole, later those rotating metal tubes, opening and closing holes from the 1st century BCE on. Invented, it seems, originally in Greece, so that's Pronomos, the famous Theban Olates, who reportedly was the first to modulate between 3 different tonalities on one and the same pair of pipes. And we find instruments that might be able to do this because they have mechanism quite soon afterwards. Here in the model from on Pergamon, we find those later different type modulating instruments in Pompeii. Many of them we are just studying. The greater bulk of them, those are the best studied so far. We have the wonderful evidence from Meroe. We are just on the verge of publishing reconstruction interpretation. Those are 200 fragments, so huge and very rewarding archaeological, musicological puzzle work. So that's outside the Greek and Latin world. So that's Black African kingdom, the Empress of Nubia and her tomb pyramid. And also beautiful instruments, bone instruments here in the Hellenistic kingdoms of Bactria, of the history of which we don't know very much, but which were famously rich and existed until about 100 BCE, and then broke down under the onslaught from the north and later also from the east, from China. Here's an example, Roman period from London. So you can see the same idea was around as practiced music belonging to the Hellenistic Roman culture all over the Mediterranean and south until modern Sudan. And here we got an example of apparently a Western import into Han China. So you can see a very big nose denoting probably a Western barbarian in the context of the Western goddess Shi Wangmu. So we had all of players from the British Islands to the Han court, so from the Pacific to the Atlantic. On the other hand, lyre playing was also very widespread. The first clear depictions come from the earliest cultures that give us clear depictions from Sumer, but we get then instruments in Egypt, in Palestine, in Crete, and here the Greek tradition starts, but also Spain, Italy, and a different type in the north here, 4th century already in the hand of Esquician. That tradition is not very well attested otherwise. Here's a French player, Gallic player, but we get basically the same type of instrument, long, slender, and that knob here at the bottom for fastening strings in some way in the Germanic region from Scandinavia to Germany and the British Islands. It's called the Nordic lyre or whatever. And the last vestiges of this have still been around in the 20th century up in Siberia. So that's basically surviving lyre traditions mostly in Africa, in Egypt, and in the Arabic Peninsula. So this is an electric lyre. In antiquity, we seem to have mainly 3 regions. We get flat-based lyres in the east, we get round-based lyres originally in the Mediterranean, and we get those long, slender lyres in the north. And these must have developed independently already for quite a long time. So that might be, yeah, we just don't know. Early Bronze Age or even Neolithic, whatever. Music theory, since it was not based on the lute, and it couldn't be based easily on the lyre if it was based on measurements and numbers, because open strings can't be measured. Everything depends on the thickness of the strings and the tension, which are all very difficult to measure. So early Greek music theory seems to have been based on the aulos instead, on the double pipe. And here's a couple of texts which seem to point to that. The first is a later report that early Pythagorean writers focused on the aulos, and the later is a quotation from Archytas, so from the first Pythagorean writer we really have a longer passage of, and he also refers not to the lyre, he refers to the bull roarer and the stick and some kind of wind instruments, but he doesn't refer to the lyre, the kithara, whatever, but he refers to the aulos as well. So physics and harmonics, starting with the wind instrument, which is, as a reed instrument, not very easy to measure. So you always get just a rough idea of how really the measurements are. So you understand, okay, twice the length is a octave, and you can see the fifth and the fourth, but you can't really measure the difference between different sizes of semitones. The instrument doesn't work well enough because the reed, the double reed, is fuzzy. You can bend the pitches. You can't measure this. So it gives you an intellectual understanding, it gives you a rough understanding, and the rest is being worked out intellectually originally. So those are two ways of creating scales. The first we have seen is tuning instruments by concord. And we have this first in the cuneiform texts. We find this with the Pythagorean Philolaus. So we're talking about nice sounding relations of octaves, fifths and fourths between different strings. We find it later in Arabic sources starting from Al-Kindi. And a rival system and a very, very different system is making instruments. And then here a typical way would be tuning them partially by ear, fifth, fourth, octaves, but in between that, just drilling some finger holes at roughly the same distance, because also that's how our fingers are spaced. They're not spaced very unevenly, but if you just hold your hand, stretch it for finger holes, then the easiest way is to have them roughly equally spaced, both for frets on the lute and for finger holes on the pipe. And we find this equal spacing on instruments from Egypt, from the Pharaonic period up until late antiquity. We find it first mentioned in Al-Farabi as used on the lute, but we have it in the archaeology even earlier. So what are the differences between the two approaches? The tuning by concord is based on simultaneous sounds. So you pluck two strings at the same time, and then you can easily hear whether this is a perfect fifth or fourth or octave. On the other hand, physical equidistance is most useful for simultaneous sounds, moving over a melody on the frets of a lute, opening and closing finger holes, playing a melody on pipes. Creating a scale by concord is related to tuning, physical equidistance to finger spans. Let's focus a moment on how this tuning by concords works. I love to call it pentonic. You will typically find it called Pythagorean tuning, but that's Eurocentric. And yeah, it's wrong. So It was not invented by Pythagoras. It was used by Pythagoreans like everybody else, but we have much earlier evidence for it with the cuneiform sources. So that's the first. The second millennium BC, that's how the cuneiform sources describe it for some string instrument of nine strings. You choose a starting string, and whatever starting string you choose will define the tuning. And then you just go upwards a fourth, or if this is not possible, you go downward a fifth and tune the next note and the next note and the next note and the next note and the next note. And after 6 steps, you got 7 notes in the octave tuned. If there are more strings, you tune octaves down. So could you just check this on such a 9-string instrument. So here, if I choose the starting strings, I go upward a fourth when I can. And there I'm ready. Stop here, and then if I want to go downward again, I get a tritone instead of a fifth or a fourth. And to resolve this, I would need to retune exactly the strings from which I have started. And if I continue doing that, then either I retune my instrument, or if I keep my strings and add an extra string, then I get an additional semitone in my scale. Both is possible. The second way, I create a modulating instrument. In the first way, I just retune my instrument. And the cuneiform sources just describe all those tunings and retuning. So that's a way that somehow comes automatically if you have a number of open strings. In some way, you need to learn how to order this to a single series of intervals. And that's all we know about cuneiform music. This is the famous hymn 6 from Ugarit, where this musical system was used for notating music. The accompaniment to a song whose melody. The Greeks did it different. What can we observe on lyres? We need not go to the semitone. We can stop that fifth and fourth tuning before we get to diatonic, then we get anhemitonic, pentatonic, and that's still around in Africa. Or we can have 7 notes in the octave, then we get what we have on the European lyre and on the Mediterranean lyre. So that's an old rift, but they are both based on tuning in fifth, fourth. Same system, but different way how to pursue it. If you pursue it even further, you get the full chromatic scale, and this we have in China originally. And we don't know whether something else might have been around. We get different lyre cultures where we just don't have any information. But most probably all those Bronze Age and Iron Age musical cultures around the Mediterranean were somehow compatible. Here we find on a Neo-Hittite slab a typical Eastern lyre and a typical Greek-style lyre just playing together in the same orchestra. So Greek lyres, in Philolaos we get the idea that an octave on the lyre is structured into a fifth from the bottom and a fifth from the top, which also gives you a fourth from the bottom and the fourth from the top, defines 4 strings. Aristotle gives us a quotation, which is probably from some Pythagorean writing, where we can see that they already attributed simple numbers to those relations, which give you the frequency relations. And then much later, Ptolemy gives us 6 lyre tunings, Kithara tunings, in use in his time. And here's a visual representation of these. And you can see there are many different sizes of tones and of semitones and everything, but the basic structure has stayed the same since the times of classical Greek period, Philolaos, as this structure, which probably was the original idea of a harmonia. It's an octave that is harmoniously divided into fifths and fourths, and some additional notes, which then gives you a Dorian tuning or a Lydian tuning or whatever. And from here we can start with music theory, because we can see there are things that remain constant and there are things that change, and we have a structure of octaves and fourths, and in between the fourths a lot of different tunings are found. And then sometime in the late classical period, at the latest, people abstracted this to the famous tetrachord-based Greek harmonic system, meaning understanding an octave as having exactly that basic structure, and then understanding the fourth as having one particular of several possible. Well, several possible, those would be all those divisions of the fourth that were described by some ancient theories. And you can see they come in three flavors: diatonic at the bottom, chromatic, and enharmonic. And you can see the upper interval is just about the tone. In diatonic, it's 1.5 a tone. In chromatic, it's about 2 tones in enharmonic, and the lower 2 tones then have to share in the rest of the space. So 3 genera, many different flavors, shades of those genera, some of them described in terms of semitones, quarter tones, thirds of a tone, and most others here described in terms of integer relations. And the latter are normally not very trustworthy, but often just some mathematical games. So some of them we can simply detract from the musical evidence because they bear all the hallmarks of being a mathematical invention. But still a lot remain. Aristoxenus finally gives us a unified theory of tetrachords, where you have the standard way of enharmonic quarter tones, chromatic semitones, diatonic semitone plus tones, which is useful because it all can be described in a simple grid of quarter tones, but it's just not even half of the story, because in reality Aristoxenus said you could tune anything in between as well. So basically in between the 2 fixed, you had the 2 moving, and those 2 moving could go over a complete span. So the upper moving note could be anything from a semitone to a minor third above the lowest note, and the lower note then might be anything in between, cutting them in half, and then here interestingly staying a semitone above the lower note and not being allowed to get any further. That is interesting because it could have been much more symmetric. These are some particular tunings which Aristoxenus figures out of the infinity of possibilities, and he gives names to these. If you want to play around with ancient tunings and listen to them for yourself, just check this code and download this software I made. It comes also in English, with English terms and Greek. And it works quite simple. So here we have it live. You got the tunings of Ptolemy, but you can also select between your own tonos and your own tuning, and then using the number keys you can play around. So this would be the Lydian tuning. it's a septimal semitone, and this seems to be what makes the mode of Ptolemy's times. But there's also much funnier tunings, tropoi, which is chromatic in the upper half. So if we go here through the octave, the lower is sort of just diatonic, but the upper is really weird. So this is really something that comes from the 2nd century AD, but it's solid information about how intervals sounded in that period. So Aristoxenus again, 2 principles for understanding music. The first is very universal. Harmonically successive notes are separated by 3 steps spanning a fourth, or by 4 steps spanning a fifth. So that ensures continuity. Both continuity within a single scale, but also by alternating between the fifth and the fourth thing, continuity between modulating between different scales around the circle of fifth. The second principle is just what we were talking about, that within a fourth, the notes should be restricted by this particular scheme. The first is absolutely universal, expressed. The second has no basis, no general basis apart from the experience of a native ancient Greek writer in what sounds right for him. And that's not any kind of anthropological or mathematical given. It's just what they had around. And if we have a look how this applies, it doesn't even apply simply in ancient times. So even though Aristoxenus gives that good general idea, in practice, he leaves the possibility open to have mixtures of different options. In this case, the sequence wouldn't even apply, because if you mix 2 different genera, you don't get a fifth or a fourth every 3rd notes, but it's different. And only the underlying general idea gives you the neat structure, and the actual music doesn't. So you get that web, but within that web, everything might be different. In Ptolemy, you get those 6 tunings, and they are, almost all of them are example of mixture between different things, where Aristoxenus principle 1 also doesn't apply, but it applies to the basic system of Ptolemy, where those mixtures are selections of. So it's something that can't be read from a single piece of music, but only from a collective understanding of everything that is music. In Aristides Quintilianus, we get an idea of very old enharmonic scales, and also these show mixtures between enharmonic and diatonic. Again, we have notes that wouldn't be able to sit together in a single piece on principle 1 alone. So principle 1 is the general idea that gives us heptatonicity, the basis of 7 well-defined notes in the octave, but reality of music goes beyond that. And this is most well preserved in today's Makamat, so Arabic, Iranian, Iraqian, modern Greek musics, where you get such divisions of the 4th or of the 5th and can mix different ways of them, mostly lute-based now. So it was transferred to a different instrument, where it makes actually much more sense than in the Greek system itself. So how the how this worked with ancient lutes, we don't know because the lute cultures aren't here. Okay, I should come to an end slowly, I think. We still get a problem with the pipes. So if we had a Aristoxenus system of fourth and would not restrict it, how he restricted it, but if we said, yes, the lower interval can always cut the upper into halves, we would get a note disposition like this. And actually, scales like this are what we find in all the early alloy that were excavated. So here we never find the small interval we would expect for Aristoxenus. We always find a larger interval here. And so it seems the ancient instruments are not built for ancient theory in that way, but you need to play against the instrument in some way. So if we only had the archaeology, we would get a totally different idea of ancient music. We need the archaeology and the texts. So you can see how precarious the situation is in a culture where we have only the instrument, because they might not reflect. So this appears Violet's principle too. And if we take such a typical instrument, so this is the Pidna, we have sort of equidistant double pipes, but no equidistant scales. So if to play the scales of theory, we either have to omit one of the finger holes and half cover one of the holes, then we get enharmonic, or we could have the upper hole playing as well, but in order to get a real Greek diatonic, we would still need to half cover the lower hole. We get the lower hole, which is fully open only for enharmonic, and is half closed for one of the enharmonic notes and for the diatonic. So I brought you the difference. So this is the Posidonia aulos, and I can try to play a scale on it. So let me do it first only on one pipe to get the melodic scale. So if I only open one finger hole after the other, we get something that sounds like a rast makam. Or with the lower note of rast. But this was never a Greek scale, but then we need to or enharmonic. Or with both pipes together. Too much open now. So we seem to be able to trace the idea of those three ancient genera from the two different traditions, one tuning of open strings, the other playing equidistant pipes, and those two instruments playing together would give you the genera on the pipes and perhaps a different kind of enharmonic even on strings, and both together then unified into grand system of Aristoxenus. So Aristoxenus, principle one, holds true in a lot of the musics we have around until modern Western music. That's fully Aristoxenian diatonic with all the chromatic extra notes and the tune, the circular fifth. It holds true for makam music. Mostly it holds true for African music in the sense of, well, we don't have the semitones of diatonic, but otherwise. It doesn't hold true for African musics that are based on overtones instead of tuning in fifths and fourths. So musics based on playing trumpets or playing the musical bow, for instance. But principle 2 doesn't hold true for everything a bit more Eastern, because Makam music incorporates both the really equidistant thing, Makam Rast, and the different arrangements of tones and semitones in the divisions that are called Hijaz. And these intrude into Eastern chant, modern Makam musics up to modern Greek and Balkan, northwise, also Jewish music, of course. So this is no longer Aristoxenian. Yeah, okay, we might stop here perhaps. I've talked for more than an hour.
As you want, we can follow if you want, huh?
Yeah, I can go on a little if you like, but perhaps we should rather discuss as you prefer. I can talk and talk and talk.
Perhaps we can follow until 12:30 or 15 or half an hour if you want.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, then next I'll talk about how modulating systems seem to have evolved. Because on such a pipe, you got your finger holes, you can half cover them, okay, but it's not that easy to move between different scales. But at some point, instruments were built modulating, and seems to have been first done by the Greeks, and it's quite understandable because the Greek musical culture was so much competitive, as so many aspects of ancient Greek life. So it was famous single individuals who played at the games, who traveled from court to court, from musical games to musical games, and tried to outperform everybody else. In order to outperform everybody else, you need something novel. That might be a novel instrument, that might be having more strings on your instrument, managing to play with more strings, managing to play with more finger holes, but then if you have more finger holes than you got fingers, you need to do something about the additional finger holes, you need to develop some kind of mechanism. And this seems to have started towards the end of the 5th century. And here's my old reconstruction about how this happened. First, what we get of evidence, okay, let me hide this again. From Aristoxenos, we get a remark that a system before him placed the individual scales at very, very funny distances, which incorporate not only tones, but also 3/4 tone steps. And Aristoxenos says that's useless for the modulation. And of course, it's right, because the circle of fifths, which is useful for modulation, never produces 3/4 tone steps. So it's a way of arranging scales, but it's obviously some sort of weird compromise. Then Aristides Quintilianus, we had him already, gives us much, much later those shapes of old scales, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixed Lydian, also another kind of Lydian, which it details in terms of tones, quarter tones, and two-tone, ditone intervals. And this is agreed among scholars that he took this from some almost certainly Aristoxenian writing that is lost to us. And he ties these harmoniae, as he calls those modes, to Plato's discussion in the laws. So the basic interest for Roman period sources was, what are those famous harmoniae divine Plato was talking about. And that's why we get these transmitted at such a later date. And now it happens if we put those structures at the distances that Aristoxenus tells us, we find out that curiously they all align at their highest node. And there must be a reason for that, and it's not so difficult to see that reason. If you got an aulos, you always got a single thumb hole for your single thumb. So if you want to use all your 5 fingers, you should always have your thumb hole available, and that means the uppermost holes should be aligned, whatever the scale is. So if you change the nodes of the finger holes, still they should remain in the same range around at the top, and that's what we find here. So we can apply the ancient notational signs to this, because we got the notation of those scales, and then we find out that they all stop at what was written as this sign, which might stand for nete, highest note, the original notation, or these are the easier readable, just alphabetic signs. You get down to omega for this lowest octave note here. Yeah, if we then look for what's finger span this might be, because we know the pitch of those notes, and so we can calculate what is the relation between finger holes that play those pitches, and we get a span of 14 centimeters between the upper highest note and this note here, and this can be easily played by one hand, but not much more. You can't go down lower with the span. So this would be what is melodically available for a single hand. And yeah, if we got what is melodically available, we might wonder whether this instrumental notes have some relation to the melodies we have preserved from that period. Because if this was indeed a typical top note of an ancient aulos, then perhaps the melodies we have, even if they are vocal melodies, might still reflect the highest top note of the instrument as typical highest note. And so we have a handful of melody fragments from the same Hellenistic period. And luckily, we have a second control group in the Roman period fragments, because these are clearly distinguished by a historical gap of almost 2 centuries. They are very different in terms of how they use keys, and so we can individually test 2 different scales. So if we look for fragments, pieces which don't go higher than the top note we have developed here theoretically, and make a table between early and late fragments, and those which stay below and those which don't, we find that 71% of the earliest do and only 40% of the later do. And this is nicely significant on a level of 5%, which is absolutely not bad, given that we don't have that much melodies from the earlier period at all. And if we look for pieces which indeed have precisely that top note, remember those are all fragments, then we get percentages of 43 against 16%, and again, this is again significant. It's the same level. So it seems that the papyri and few stone inscriptions of early melodies bear out precisely that reconstruction of our early system. Here we have one papyrus from the early period which has two instrumental lines between some vocal lines. And if we have a look at the instrumental lines, we have a first one which gives us an undulating melody. Then we have a second line, so the undulating melody stays precisely here in the region of what we can finger with one hand. The second part drops to individual bass notes below, two bass notes below that. So how does it sound? Second line. Very different. So the first line seems to bear out what we have in. What about the bass notes? Well, we know there were those slider mechanisms. If we produce a theoretical aulos which plays all the notes we have on that papyrus in instrumental notation, it would look like this. This is the lower broken part of a model aulos from Pergamon, which I showed before, just from three sides. You can see there's the exit, there's one hole hidden behind this closed slider, one hole with an open slider, and here the slider is lost, but we can restore where the note would have been. And you can see that both the fingered part here is precisely where we would expect it, and the bass notes are basically where we would expect them. So there's even material evidence. And now, not all published, but we will have more published material evidence than this very soon. So I hope next year we'll have something from the Merori pipes and something from the Oxus find, which all establish the same. So finally, in late antiquity, all this came together into a note system of notes that could be laid out in a modern diagram like this. You can see the instrumental notation, the vocal notation, and 15 scales implementing the full circle of fifths. If you played ancient melodies, actually you wouldn't need to know it all. This was the range of the early fragments. This is the range of the Roman period fragments. If you learned the lyre as a Roman period student, you would perhaps have to know 14, 15, 16 different note signs, and with this you could play simple music. So my idea how this all evolved now recapitulated in abstract history. We start with the simple aulos, which played diatonic and enharmonic tones and quarter tones, and lyre tunings, on the other hand, which played diatonic and chromatic. So they overlapped with the diatonic, but you can't really play chromatic on the simple aulos. You can't easily play enharmonic on a lyre because you use much of the inherent resonance if you try to tune quarter tones on the lyre. Just doesn't make much sense musically. From here, we probably got an early system of notation. With the alloy, you got the physical awareness of simple ratios, 2 to 1 for the octave and so on, just to make an aulos. And from here, you start with ratio theory, which then became known under the name of Pythagorean music theory. On the other hand, the aulos developed to modulating instruments. Here you needed to align different scales on the same instrument, and from here you come to the concept of musical keys, and then to the system of the circle of fifths, sort of. On the other hand, you get the theoretical idea of octave species, which are not very important for music because most melodies don't happen to cover just exactly an octave. They may stay below an octave, they may expand more of an octave. So octave species, which are so important in modern handbooks, both for medieval music and for ancient music, just don't play a practical role in ancient music and are only a marginal role in ancient music theory. But the musical keys, they are really important. They get that. They may be called tonoi, they may be called tropoi, and that's the description then on how the circle of fifth unfolds and how to notate all those different things. On the other hand, we got the lyre tunings with that fixed framework and some moving things within that framework, and there we get that idea of some notes are fixed, some notes are moving, and blending this with the aulos and extended instruments, we finally end up with that 2-octave so-called perfect system, a model scale to describe anything within. So anything you had in music, you could describe as some subset of the perfect system, or if it was really modulating, subset of several perfect systems arranged in the circle of fifth. And at this stage, we get into another way of notating, including keys, different keys, notating different keys. And here Aristoxenus took over and codified all this into 3 genera, diatonic, chromatic, and harmonic, an infinity of possible shades, and 13 keys, meaning over every semitone within the octave, including the octave itself, so you could describe any sort of modulation. So you had the system of tonoi, you got the perfect system as the thing that was arranged in semitone steps, and you also got the idea of octave species, all within a simple, nice diagram. We don't have the diagram itself, but we have all the ideas within Aristoxenean theory, and we knew that he developed such a kind of diagram. And from there, including Aristoxenus, we finally get to the extensive notational diagram, which might have been only around in the Roman period, which I showed you first. So 15 scales, which just makes 3 times 5. So you could have 5 basic scales and then hyper and hyposcales. Dorian, hyperdorian, hypodorian, and so on, which is just introducing a new kind of symmetry. And on the other hand, ratio theory kept on having its own life, not influencing music making proper, because you don't need ratio theory for music making. You don't need ratio theory to tune a lyre because it doesn't help you with open strings. You need to tune them by ear. It could help you with tuning a lute if you arrange the frets, but you don't do it anyway. And even then it's not mathematically accurate because you need to press down a string to the fret, and so you change the tension of the string and you don't get the mathematical result of that. So you never get the mathematics on a real instrument. You only get them from mathematics. So that lived on. People tried to describe what there was. So somebody incorporated the perfect system in ratio theory. This might have been Archytas quite early on. Somebody incorporated the 3 genera of Aristoxenus. This may well have been Eratosthenes, so one of the most important scientists of Alexandria, because his tunings very well reflect Aristoxenes' tunings. And finally, somebody incorporated musical keys, and we know precisely who this was, because this was none other than Ptolemy, whose work we have, except for the final 2 chapters of the 3rd book. But yeah, and Ptolemy is absolutely great because he developed also scientific experimental instruments to really test the pitch relations with precision. And he gave series of experiments with his readers should test his propositions and find out that his mathematics, he also starts from mathematics, then looks at which mathematical models would actually fit music that is played. And he shows that the music from the concert hall of his time is just a subset of what can be mathematically derived. There's a little bit of cheating in how to make the models. So the music forces him to incorporate scales into a system which are not mathematically so nice and wouldn't have come up naturally. But he needs to admit that, he needs to take these in, and actually nowadays this shows us that this was not a mathematical idealization, because it is not ideal. So Ptolemy really gives us intervals from antiquity. Yeah. So ratio theory then lived on into the Middle Ages independently, and Aristoxenus plus notation as merged lived on into music making, so this defined Roman period music making. And yeah, I think that might be a history of ancient music. Yeah, we covered another half system. So if I can have 3 minutes more, I will try to insert all this into the musics that are around, starting from the Bronze Age to modern period. This could be done quite quickly. So what we know of the Bronze Age is that heptatonic, diatonic kind of koine, superstratum, so a true diatonic. The ancient Near Eastern sources don't give anything except of diatonic, like the white keys on the modern piano. But on the other hand, we have these equidistant instruments, which we just find in the archaeology in ancient Egypt, for instance, and also on lutes. So we have both side by side, the tuning of open strings and the tuning of lutes and pipes, which give different musics. True diatonics gives us chromatic and diatonic, as we have said, tuning in fifth and fourth. Tuning the pipes, on the other hand, merging with the pentonic tuning, gives us the so-called enharmonic, with those quarter tones. And here we are what Aristoxenus calls typical Greek music. So a Greek writer says those quarter tones are not around anywhere else. That's native to Greek music. This died out quite soon, it seems, so we no longer have any quarter tone music around. Chromatic lived on longer. We have still evidence for it in the Roman period, but then also died out. We don't have those semitone, seminone, minor third music anymore in the Middle Ages. Diatonic lived on into the Middle Ages. We very well have preserved it in church chant. It is the basic of medieval music theory. On the other hand, equidistant diatonic with neutral thirds lived on into what we then have as the Makam Rast, which we find in late antique lutes, in the fretboards, which find in Arabic theory, starting from Al-Farabi, and which today lives also on in various piping traditions. The neutral thirds in all kinds of bagpipes, and also the duduk and other pipe instruments. Combining this rast, on the other hand, and pure diatonic on the one hand would lead to Makam music. And this was only possible in the High Middle Ages, when the Arabic, Iranian, Persian musicians just skipped having frets on their lutes. So the ancient Arabic lutes had a fretboard, and might have different arrangements, but to play the different musics on the same instrument, they just stopped having frets and only stopped those strings with their fingers, and so then they were able to make those microtonal differences which make modern Near Eastern music, Western Asian music, so interesting that interplay between different kinds of semitones, different kinds of thirds, that then lives on into classical Turkish music and all that is in harmonic, so in melodic ways, so much more sophisticated than Western music. Here then we got also that additional tetrachord by tetrachordal division as semitone minor third semitone above, which explodes both of Aristoxenos' principles and is called the Hijaz, Jins Hijaz, and all the three together then form Makan music and then influence the old tradition of church chant into what we now have as Eastern church chant, while Western church chant only retained the old diatonic mode. Yeah, and then there's modern European music, which comes with a lot of different things, namely with functional harmony. And this, I'm pretty much convinced, is not really a late medieval or Renaissance invention developing somehow out of church chant, but I'm pretty much convinced that this is a quite old European thing developing from things that are just eclipsed from our view by all the sources up to the High Middle Ages, only reflecting the Greek view, and the Greek view is an Eastern view. Because we have triple pipes, which survive in Sardinia nowadays as the launedas. We have evidence for these in early medieval Europe, also on the British Islands and also in Spain. So this was a Western thing. And with the triple pipes, you have a drone and you have two melodic pipes. And with this, you evidently need to incorporate thirds and into your harmonic system. And you got the drone, and then you got harmonies that work against the drone, that work together with the drone. So you get evidently and automatically some kind of at least bipolar harmonics, something at harmonic rest with the drone and something in contrast with the drone. So some kind of bipolar harmonization. And then you get the 6-stringed medieval northern lyre, which also seems, with its semitone in the center, extremely well fit for Western European music, which is contrast between a major and a minor chord set apart by a tone in between. So I think that this Western European music blending within the strand that came from church chant and then developed over the organon and the new music into something much more harmonic, then incorporated the looming underlying substratum of folk music that had been around, the music of the Germanic court as well, heroic singing to the lyre, and blended all this into the functional harmonic music, which is the basis of everything then, starting from Renaissance and Baroque. Yeah, and this small part here is ancient music, incorporated the triad of chromatic, diatonic, and enharmonic for a very short period, but all, I think, understandably related to different strands of music that are around both in the West and in the East. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you very, very, very much, Stephan. We have listened to your lecture with enjoyment, and thank you for such a complete and overview of harmonics, and thank you for the accurate and beautiful presentation too. We are glad to hear you, and now perhaps there are questions questions, commentaries, I don't know. No sé si hay preguntas, hay algún comentario, alguna pedido alguna aclaración, algún punto que haya quedado oscuro. Es el momento de preguntar. It's time for asking. ¿Ninguna pregunta, comentario? Aquí dice que le gustaría que el profesor indique algunas lecturas. Cayo asks for bibliography.
Bibliography. Well, that very much depends on what you're interested in. I mean, still, this here, Martin West's book, of course, it's in some respect, it's inevitably outdated. It's from 1992, as you know, but it's still starting point for so much and so much evidence collected in the notes. So yeah, going here before going anywhere else. Then, of course, what you also know is the collection of musical fragments by Pöhlmann and West. Things that always
Oh. Nos escuchamos, ¿no?
submitting the project report. Yeah, and yeah.
No, we have lost you for a seconds, for a minute. We don't know what you have said about Pöhlmann, I guess.
Pöhlmann. Yeah, so the edition, 2001 edition, this one, right? Yes, and we hope to publish an electronic edition of all the extant fragments in a few weeks. So then all this should also be available on the internet, also with audio and all the variants, and also links to the images of all the papyri and inscriptions, so everybody can have a look for themselves whether they believe the edition or not.
Great. Where will it be available?
That's a good question. I'm still not absolutely sure. I hope to get the dedicated internet address here at the Academy. If not, I will see. Perhaps I purchase some domain for that. But yeah, that's a final step I still have not done because there was a lot of proofreading and getting the technicalities, and I still need to do some proofreading of the transcriptions, programming.
Okay, thank you. ¿Otras preguntas? Aprovechemos.
Hola, si yo quería preguntar algo.
Sí.
Al profesor Stephan, al comienzo había dicho que el lenguaje de los griegos era diferente y por tanto la música era diferente. Si él podría ahondar un poquito en esa relación entre el lenguaje, las palabras y la música.
Stefan, he asks, you have said the music of Greeks was different because of the nature of the language. If you can go deeper in this,
yeah, what I tried to say, and I certainly did it too quickly, was that some people have thought that the music of the Greeks was so very different because also the language was different. But I regard this as an example of Orientalism. So construing the Greeks as something different from us, which we can't really understand, and projecting onto the Greeks some very primeval, pure unity of speech and music and movement and dance and all that sort, which is at the same time Orientalist and colonial as well, because it at the same time construes the Greeks as a sort of the origin of music, which is a prolongation of what the Greeks of ancient Greek music history, who started also with semi-legendary figures, but it has no place, of course, in 20th or 21st century music history, when we know that music is as old as at least Homo sapiens sapiens is, and perhaps older. Well, as old as the birds who are dinosaurs. So, yeah, but even human music history can now be traced back to 37,000 BC, and it was always complex. And it's not the case that the Greek started from something very simple and then we ended up with Bach and Beethoven. And this was the narrative that we got in the 19th century, and which we still sort of get in musicological handbooks, and nothing could be more wrong. So all human musics are complex, but they are complex in different ways. And that's something that Aristoxenus absolutely was able to acknowledge, because he said the old Greek music was more sophisticated rhythmically, while Greek music of his time was more sophisticated melodically. So he saw this development from one kind of sophistication to another, because music can't easily bear too much sophistication. And later this split in different ways. So in the Arabic world, so-called Arabic or the Islamic world, but including all of India and everything, we got all the sophistication of melody, all the microtonal intervals. But this is incompatible with harmonic sophistication. Europe went the opposite way by developing functional harmony, which is very, very nice, but they couldn't uphold much sophistication of melodic microtonality because it's just not compatible, and you can't have both, because if you really try to have all the microtones and still function harmony, yeah, I think the human brain is not able to cope with all that at the same time, and it just sounds wrong and confusing to us. We need to tone down things and have to sacrifice one on the altar of the other. That's so good that we have different traditions around. We can enjoy both. Of course, we can enjoy both American tradition, and we can enjoy Bach and Beethoven, and we can enjoy very different Chinese or Indian traditions or whatever. So it's possible to adapt the brain to all those, but not easily playing all those together at the same time. So yeah, so I don't think that the Greek language had too much an influence. Of course, it's true that if you wanted to think Greek, you should not do violence to the length of the syllables. So a short syllable needed to be reasonably short when singing it. Also otherwise it would sound wrong. It would give you a wrong text. And a long syllable, on the other hand, could be long or longer or even longer. That would still be some kind of long syllable. So in this respect, you needed to fit the language to the rhythm and the rhythm in some sort to the language, yes. But it's not such a big deal. We know there were musical style which reflected the typical pitch contour of speech in the pitch contour of the melody. You could do that or you could do it not. Both worked because the melody is not that important for understanding ancient Greek. There are not so many words which would mean something different if the melody is wrong. So in Mandarin Chinese, that would be the case. If a word has the wrong intonation, it might mean something different, or in many African languages, but not in Japanese or in Greek, which in this case is much more related with modern Japanese. There you can sing against the intonation and it's easy still to understand the text.
Bueno, acá una pregunta, Sergio, la hago soy Germán Rossi porque acá ahí abajo dice Sergio Antonini, aclaro, la hago en castellano para, para si la hacemos más rápido. La pregunta sería, ¿qué piensa Stephan sobre las reconstrucciones, la posibilidad moderna de hacer reconstrucciones sonoras de toda esta música, dada la discusión sobre autenticidad y otras situaciones que se han dado en la música antigua, no tan antigua?
Yeah, well, authenticity is always a very problematic word, of course. We should not imply this to anything we are doing. So we can certainly get towards elements, authentic elements within what we might be doing and other things that are historically informed or not. So we can tune our lyres to an ancient tuning. We know the pitch and we know the intervals. So I'm pretty sure my lyre is tuned like a lyre from the 2nd century school, Roman period school. And then I can sing a melody to those very pitches which was composed at that very period. And we were probably composed pretty much with that same tuning in mind. So we get a melody with the right intervals at the right pitch. We don't know, of course, the precise tempo. It should be, we don't really know which sort of voice it was typically done with, but a clear voice seemed to have been an ideal from what we get from the sources. But then we come to accompaniment and then things become a lot muddier. So we need to accompany ourselves, and the best I can think of is to play harmonic relations which we can extract from the melody in the accompaniment as simultaneous sounds. So when I go on to compose an accompaniment for, say, a song of Mesomedes, I look at how the pitches work together, and then I use these for strummed and plucked accompaniment, so we can get the basic idea that we should use strumming and damping technique and should also use some plucking in between, but we don't really know how precisely they did it in antiquity. So that can be historically informed, and it can definitely be historically uninformed. We can point to modern performances and say, this was clearly not how it was in antiquity. And we can try to do a performance where we can't say this was clearly not done like that in antiquity, but we can't hope for something. We can say this was exactly like it was done in antiquity. Just excluding the negative and then filling in the gap.
Perdón, yo tengo una pregunta, si no es Los, ¿sí?
Sí, pregunta.
No sabía si se me escuchaba. Los fragmentos que han quedado de melodías en notación, la notación de esos fragmentos, ¿qué relación tiene con la teoría, con las teorías de la época? Hay fragmentos notados con notación que haya utilizado algún teórico o ¿de dónde provienen esas notaciones? Es algo que siempre me ha llamado la atención.
Yeah, the whole system of notation is fully built on the systems of theory. So all those fixed notes, movable notes, diatonic, chromatic, all this is directly built into notation. So after centuries of mutually influencing each other, they had a very nice coexistence. And also some of the theoretical treatises use notation to illustrate things. Some don't. So Aristoxenus himself said, I'm not using notation because that's outside of the science. That's practical application, useful, but it's outside of the science. But Boethius uses notations. Bacchius, famously, Bacchius is very interesting because he presupposes that you learn your instrument, you learn notation before you learn theory. So you come from practice, and only after that you have the ear, you learned what the instruments are, only then you can understand theory. So yes, that, but notation alone doesn't suffice because you can notate things in the same manner, but the microtonality might be very different. So you have a semitone in the notation, but it might be a small semitone like Ptolemy's liked them, or it might be a larger semitone and you just don't know. So notation only goes that far. It tells you this is the lowest semitone in the tetrachord, and then other information needs to join in and tell you which kind of semitone now you would really want for this kind of music on your lyre, or whether this depends on your personal taste, on the taste of the audience, on the decade, on the fashion, whatever. So we have a really good glimpse into the fashion at Ptolemy's period. And some of this seems to perpetuate things that may have been around centuries ago, but that's not so clear. And we also see things that have changed. So in Ptolemy's time, clearly things have changed that were much different 200, 300 years earlier. So if it comes to enharmonic or chromatic, Ptolemy insists on being the lower semitone being much smaller than the higher semitone. All the earlier theorists insisted of them being equal. So we have no doubt that in earlier times they were pretty much equal, and in Ptolemy's times they were pretty much not equal. Oh yeah, there is fashion, and of course within 1,000 years of music history we can't expect there not to be. But all this blends in well with theory. Even those Ptolemaic differently sized tunings would normally fit in with what Aristoxenus allows. Not within what he describes as typical, but what he describes as possible. That's good enough, right? So yeah, so notation typically reproduces theory. There are few instances where it's difficult to see what exactly is going on in notation. There's a handful of highly modulating pieces where there is a note sign which may have been chosen by the composer, not thinking about the exact relation between the circle and fifth and so on, but just by, okay, that's the next letter in the alphabet, I think that's the appropriate note sign to use at this point. But it's difficult to look into somebody's mind whose composition is only only survives in a very small scrap of papyrus, of course.
Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Estamos ya casi en hora.
I don't know if it's possible to make a quick question.
Okay. Sure.
So, first of all, thank you, Professor, because the presentation was quite enlightening and entertaining. I'd like to make just a quite specific question about the tuning ratios. I'd like to ask if there were more information that, taking into account the ancient information we've got about the different tuning ratios. For example, you showed one from Didymos. So I don't know if there are more available that take into account the ancient writings to propose different ratios. For example, as you previously mentioned, the different kinds of tones and semitones according to the specific time period. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have that so-called Pythagorean diatonic. So we tune in fifth and fourth, and we get tones that are nicely 9 to 8, and then the semitone, which is a bit smaller than the modern tempered semitone, with 256 to 243. So-called lema, or bakia in Arabic, the remainder, just the remainder. So this must have been important in musical practice throughout antiquity. We find it in Plato's writing, we find it in the Timaeus as the tuning that was inscribed in the creation of the world as the inherent harmony of the division of the cosmic soul as well. So this, in spite of that funny semitone, it was good enough for Plato to build a fictitious physics on it. A physics which is at the same time, of course, a spiritual worldview as well. So it was good enough, meaning nobody said, nah, that's not what we really want. And this is presupposed in Archytas, this is the Eratosthenes, this is necessarily the Ptolemy, even if the lemma it does not conform to Ptolemy's mathematical ideals. Still, he needed to adopt it because you need it for modulation. If you go across a few tonoi, few keys in the circle of fifths, you end up with having that, because that's just what you get. So the whole of Ptolemy's 7 tonoi is based on the circle of fifths and incorporates this tuning as well. So that was clearly there always. The modification of it, it's very difficult to see. So what Eratosthenes does apparently is just to find a mathematically nicer way to describe Aristoxenos tones and semitones within a practical deviation that is not noticeable, which is fine enough. We are here still, there's no reason to assume something is different. Archytas, who is much earlier, is a special problem, because Archytas describes mathematically a small semitone, 28 to 27, which is just 63 cents, so just a third of a tone instead of a semitone. And this seems to be possibly accurate because we get the same tuning in Ptolemy. Actually, all those tunings, we know them, almost all of them, only from Ptolemy. It's only the Pythagorean that we get in other sources. We get some funny tunings in other sources, which are mathematically placed in late sources. Nicomachus and Boethius, or the anonymous Bellermann, which we can leave out of the question here because they are not related to any practice. But of the practical, we get the Pythagorean tuning, and all the others we get only in Ptolemy's reported earlier tunings. So Akaitas. Would be great if this was actually a description of music, but yeah, I'm afraid I can't see how it possibly could be, because of all we know, Akaitas had no technical means of ascertaining the intervals he was describing, because all we see, the canon, the monochord, was only used 50 years after Akaitas. Then it seems to have been a novel device. So Akaitas must have started from the general knowledge and then worked his mathematical way. And without having any experimental means at your disposal, you have two ways of knowing what the intervals are. First, from tuning. So if you get tuning in fifth and fourth, that's fine. And then, yes, if there is that funny semitone, if you're talking about the lyre, then you could say, okay, they then tune this particular note down a little bit, and now we find a nice mathematical description for a little bit, and then we end up with that tuning. If Akaitas was thinking about the lyre here, then we might be fine with that particular septimal tuning even much later. But we can't be sure, because if he was thinking about the aulos, and we know he was working on the aulos, and it doesn't have the lyre in view in the chapter of his physics, his acoustical physics, which we have quoted, then things are very different. And then he has notation in view where he just knows that this note of diatonic and enharmonic, the same note, was somehow played by leaving the finger hole half open. This doesn't give you a stable pitch at all. And yeah, you can describe it mathematically, but it's not a fixed physical entity even you are describing here. But it's the only way then to get nice numbers and to get the enharmonic and the diatonic in a coherent description, and in a coherent description with the developing musical notation. And since it's the only way of getting a mathematical solution, we can't at the same time be sure that it also reflected reality. It's the pity of mathematics. It might work out, but it might not reflect reality at all. Like Ptolemy gives us a nice description of the musical scale in planetary movements, which had nothing at all to do with his astronomical description of planetary movement, which doesn't work out, which they never could work out. So that the whole striving for where is the music of the planets, we get something, we will think we got it, and then we look a bit closer at the planetary movement and we think it's wrong. This went on up to Kepler. Kepler then got all it on his desk and got Ptolemy on his desk and the planetary movements by Tycho, and finally just scrapped the ideas of Ptolemy and gave a different mathematical description, which worked out with those ellipses and was no longer applicable musically. So the idea of numbers worked out, but not musical numbers. But in this way, at least, ancient music theory engendered modern science. The idea of numbers should describe the world, went through music, and in this way, ancient music theory is the basis of the modern world.
Well, thank you very much. Creo que llegamos a las 2 horas. No queremos abusar. thank you, Stephan, for having dedicated these hours to us. It has been very fruitful for all of us. And heartily, we hope this can be repeated sometimes. Thank you very, very much, very much.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Yeah, thank you for bearing with me for so long.
Thank you. Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias por haber estado en este cierre del año de conferencias. Esperamos que el año que viene esto continúe dedicado a la música en la antigüedad. Y bueno, ya estaremos en contacto. Saludos a todos. Feliz fin de año y bueno, nos volveremos a encontrar. Stephan, thank you again and herzlicher Gruß aus Buenos Aires.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos. Hasta luego.
Gracias.